Welcome everybody. Welcome everybody and good evening from London. Tonight's debate, crucifixion, fact or fiction. We have two debaters. My first debater, my very good friend, Stephen Atkins, Mr. Stephen Atkins, a husband, father of four, grandfather of two, a teacher at Faith Baptist Church. Stephen normally engages with Christian and Muslim dialogue, mostly through social media and occasionally in evangelistic outreaches in Canada and United States. Stephen Atkins is one of my very good friends as well, and I really respect him very much. My second debater from the Muslim side is Mr. Kenny Bomer, author of the forthcoming book, Consider Islam. He's the president of Brazo Sport Islamic Society. Kenny is currently pursuing his bachelor's at Miska University. He's an independent researcher in comparative religion, and is a 30 years he's reverted to Islam. I welcome you guys. Thank you very much, both of you guys, for participating. I just want to make one thing clear, is that we are doing it for the sake of God, for the sake of our faith. We will be just in how we speak to each other, how we respect each other, how we love each other. There'll be a fair and just moderation here. I myself, Mustafa, will moderate. I wouldn't give one person more time than the other. I will be just. It's not about who is from what faith. It's about just and being righteous in this. The debate format, guys, quickly before we start. 20 minutes opening statement from both sides. Opening from both sides. 10 minutes rebuttal from both sides. 7 minutes second rebuttal from both sides. We'll have a 20-minute crossfire, 1 minute back and forth, and then we'll have a 5-minute closing statement. Would that be all right?
Yes.
Fantastic. So, Stephen, when you're ready, your 20-minute can start when you're ready.
Well, before we start my time, I just want to tell the room I've worked with Mustafa in the past, and he's always whenever we had our debates, or he's been the moderator, he's been fair, so I have absolutely no problem with him on that way. And this is the first time that I've had a debate with Kenny, so Kenny, thank you, and I wish to thank all those who have come by. But I'll just give me a moment here. My allergies are beginning to bother me, but now let's begin. So I'm ready to begin now, guys. The crucifixion, is it a fact that took place, or did it not take place? Now, of course, if the crucifixion took place, then Islam is false, because the Quran specifically states that it did not take place. And of course, if it did not take place, then the conclusion is that Christianity is false. But that does not necessarily mean that Islam is true. All it means is that Islam is true on one point. However, when we look at this, we have to look at the consensus of opinion. And the vast majority of serious historians attest to the crucifixion of Jesus. And in fact, it is the most attested event in ancient history. And no serious scholar would deny the crucifixion of Jesus, or that Jesus died under Pontius Pilate around 30 AD. Now, some of these scholars, modern scholars, are Geert Luderman, who is an atheist, Robert Funk of the Jesus Seminar. Now, Jesus Seminar are very, very liberal. James Dunn, Michael Goder, Marcus Borg, A.J.M. Weberburn, and of course, our favorite Bart Ehrman. And Bart Ehrman, in his book, How Jesus Became God, states, there is no doubt historically that some of Jesus' followers was raised, came to believe that he was raised from the dead. No doubt whatsoever. And this is how Christianity started. If no one had believed that Jesus had risen from the dead, he would have been lost in the history of Jewish antiquity. And Behrman also goes on to state, there are a few things that we can say with virtual certainty about Jesus. For example, he was a Jewish preacher from rural Galilee who made a fateful trip to Jerusalem and was crucified by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. And so when we look at what Bart Ehrman has to say, and I know that Muslims very often quote him, they should be considering some of these things. So I guess if those historians who believe that Jesus, and those historians who believe that Jesus was not crucified, are basically those who believe that Jesus did not exist. Now, I'm assuming Kenny does believe that Jesus actually lived as a historical person, and I hope that he's not going to use their arguments to make his case. Well, what is the consensus of those who lived in the early or the late 1st and 2nd century? Well, Tacitus, who did live in the 2nd century, a Roman historian, said that Nero falsely was charged with the guilt and punished the Christians with tortures concerning Christus, the founder and who was put to death by Pontius Pilate, who was the governor of Jerusalem under the reign of Tiberius. Lucius was also a 2nd century satirist, referred to Jesus as the man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced a new cult into the world. He denounced, of course, he denounced Christians. And Josephus, a Jewish historian who lived at the end of the 2nd, or who wrote at the end of the 1st century, said this, that Jesus was the Christ when Pilate was the governor of Jerusalem, and he had him condemned to death on the cross. And so we see that even we have these early historians who are testifying that Jesus actually not only lived, but he died by crucifixion. But what is the real issue here? And what we have to do is we do have to, I suppose, separate fact, from, or historical fact from speculation. And it is also, we have to look at basically that the earliest records we have are basically about Jesus are found in the New Testament. And though I believe this New Testament is a supernatural document and God breathed out from God, my approach is basically going to look at the New Testament as a historical document. And in doing so, we need to look at a number of questions. First question is, what happened? If Jesus did not die by crucifixion, then the Muslim must prove with a plausible alternative. In other words, he has to provide a plausible alternative as to what happened. And the other thing too is when we look at look at any ancient historical document, including the New Testament, we have to decide whether it's authentic or whether it's genuine. Dr. Timothy McGrew, professor and chair at Western Michigan University, states, an ancient document is considered authentic if it gives a substantial, truthful account of the events it reports, and is also considered genuine if it was written by the person to whom it was attributed. So the real argument here basically is the authenticity and the genuineness of the New Testament. And when we examine the four canonical Gospels, all four of them basically affirm that Jesus died by crucifixion. There's not a gospel that doesn't. And again, it'll be up to Kenny to prove otherwise. If he wants to go to the New Testament, he'll have to demonstrate that it does not teach that Jesus died by crucifixion. And again, I want to stress that the burden of proof is upon the Muslim, not upon me. The Muslim, because for approximately 1900 years, the vast majority of historians said that Jesus died by crucifixion. And again, when we look at the that the records that we have available, nearly all of them attest to the fact that Jesus was crucified. You know, in logic, there is the law of historical precedent. This means the burden of proof rests upon those who set forth a new theory. And because Muslims and a few others say that Jesus did not die by crucifixion, the burden of proof is upon them. The old test the new. And since Islam came along many centuries after Islam, the burden of proof is upon the Muslims, not upon the Christians. You know, and I think many Muslims in Kenya, they violate this principle by coming across with, you know, certain theories or trying to demonstrate that Jesus was not crucified or did not die by crucifixion. My position is, and of course I know that my Muslim friends will disagree with me, you know, it's the Bible who judges the Quran, and not the Quran does not judge the Bible. There is an article by a man called John Torres, and it's called The Three-Headed Monster of and the Evangelical Betrayal of the Bible. And he writes, and this is what I find, where I find most Muslims go. I don't know whether Kenya will go this way, but the historical era, misnamed the Enlightenment, and which began in the 17th century, was characterized by the exaltation of human reason as the only valid means to determine truth and commitment. And so if we look at that again, I don't know whether Kenya will go this way, but the arguments that I've heard most of the time is when you begin to deny the validity of the Bible or the Gospels in the New Testament, is that you're borrowing arguments from those who deny the supernatural. In other words, you're living on borrowed capital. I mean, you know, these people presuppose that there is no God, or that if there is a God, he's far away, has absolutely nothing to do with man, and does not communicate to man by supernatural means. And of course, I know that Kenny and my Muslim friends, they do believe that God does, you know, communicate through prophets. The other thing too is, I think, is that what we see here is that is the Bible guilty until proven innocent? Is that where we go with the you know, with the argument? And I want to quote from, and I did quote from this individual in one of my other debates. I can't remember who it was with, but it was from Simon Greenleaf. Now, Simon Greenleaf was an American jurist and apologist, and he wrote, and he lived in the 18th and 19th century. And he wrote, in examining the evidence of the Christian religion, it is essential to the discovery of truth that we bring to the investigation a mind freed as far as possible from existing prejudices and open to conviction. So in other words, we all should have an open mind when we look at this. Not only you know, must the Muslim have an open mind, I have to admit I must have an open mind as well. Greenleaf also has stated about ancient documents: every document apparently ancient coming from a proper repository or custody and bearing on its face no evidence of marks of forgery, the law, again, guilty until innocent until proven guilty, the law presumes to be genuine and devolves on the opposing, and it's on the opposing party, again, to prove otherwise. So what do we have? Well, we go to the earliest documents that we have. The New Testament is a first century document. There are, especially, it can be, I believe the Gospels can be demonstrated, but especially the epistles. The New Testament is the earliest document that we have about Jesus, and the New Testament was written by eyewitnesses or those who were closely associated with the events. And what does the New Testament say about Jesus? The New Testament states that Jesus was crucified outside the walls of Jerusalem. And again, we come back, is the New Testament both authentic and genuine? I think here we also need to allow the New Testament to speak for itself. An ordinary reading of the New Testament, and again, we come to the conclusion that Jesus died. Excuse me. But how do we do it? Because it is an ancient document, and so the verses must be studied in their immediate literary context and to the wider situation in which it appeared. We have to consider the biblical languages and the type of literature that are represented. And we also should be looking at the background geography and sense, and the life setting. Again, when we examine the New Testament under those rules, that we would do any type of exegesis or hermeneutics of the Bible, we come to the conclusion that Jesus died by crucifixion. And I've stated this time, I won't ask necessarily my Muslim friends to believe the Bible, but I will ask them, if you read the Bible honestly, there's only one conclusion, and that is that Jesus died by crucifixion. He rose on the third day. Well, I also wanted to touch on some of what the church fathers said. And when I mean the church fathers, of course, I will make references to mostly the church fathers who lived in the 2nd century. And if you look at what the church, and if we look at what the church fathers said, actually, if we were, God forbid, to lose all the ancient copies of the New Testament we had, we would be able to reconstruct almost the entire New Testament by quotes from the church fathers. And it's interesting, I can't quote a person unless they said it or it's been written down. And so the church fathers cannot be quoting anything from the New Testament. And I'm again emphasizing those church fathers who lived in the 2nd century. They couldn't be quoting the New Testament unless it had been
5
written.
minutes, Stephen. 5 minutes left.
So I think that we need to look at some of these ones would be Tertullian of Carthage, who lived around 207, Clement of Alexander, Irenaeus of Lyons, the Mauritanian fragment, Justin Martyr, Papias, and Ignatius. Now, all these individuals were living in the 2nd century, and but I did want to quote, and then I need to move on, from Papias. And Papias says about Mark being the interpreter of Peter, whatsoever he remembered accurately, and he goes on to say that, of course, that if we read the Gospel of Mark, that records the crucifixion of Christ. So the Mauritanian fragment attests the authorship of the New Testament, and I can quote on that. When we begin to talk about whether these things are authentic, the first real arguments came basically about the time of Augustine. And Augustine says that we don't quote any of, or we don't question the authority of Hippocrates and other people who were lived with that. But I do need to rush on. I just want to get into something I want to say. In the gospel, or in the epistle, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we have an early creed. Now, 1 Corinthians was written around 55 to 58 AD. And you have Paul quoting a creed. And this is what he said, I deliver to you of first importance, which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried and was raised from the dead. This is a mere 30 years after the event regarding that. And then he names those people, talks about Cephas and the 12 and James as being witness to the resurrection of Christ. One of the strongest arguments, and I just want to point on that, basically is when we read the Gospels, we have Jesus actually foretelling of him going to Jerusalem. And we see this in Mark 8, we see this in Matthew 16, 21 through 28. This is just after the appearance of Moses and Elijah to Jesus. We see also in Luke chapter 9 where Jesus prophesies going to Jerusalem to die by crucifixion. And if Jesus was saying these things and was not crucified, it would make him a false prophet. The other thing too is I want to touch on basically is that John and when it says, and I do want to read this, by standing by the cross, Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleophas, and Mary Magdalene. And when Jesus saw his mother, the disciple whom he loved, he said, woman, behold your son. And of course, what we see here is basically Mary and Jesus recognizing each other. Again, in the book of Acts, just 50 days after the event, we have Jesus speaking of the crucifixion when he's preaching to the people in Jerusalem. And very, very briefly, I do want to get to basically 1 minute.
Just under a minute, Stephen.
Okay. I'm talking about the criteria of embarrassment. If we know what crucifixion was in the first century, we know that it was the most horrendous thing. If you're going to start a religion, you are not going to talk about someone being crucified. That's not the way to go. You're not going to talk about a crucified Messiah or a crucified deity. Anyways, listen, my time is up. I may touch on some of these points in one of my rebuttals, but I thank you again for listening. And Kenny, I'll turn it over to you.
You still have 15 seconds, Stephen.
It's okay.
Thank you. Right. Just turn this one off. Okay, brilliant. Went really well. Kenny, when you're ready, when you're ready, my friend, I'll start the time and we can take it from there.
I'd like to start by saying Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and blessings upon each and everyone who is watching right now and who may see this in the future. I'd like to thank Stephen for participating in this debate, and I would like to thank Mustafa Ahmed for moderating. Praise be to Allah. We seek his help and his forgiveness. We seek refuge in Allah from the evil of our own souls and from our own bad deeds. Whomsoever Allah guides, none can misguide, and whomsoever Allah deems is led astray, no one can guide. I bear witness there's no God other than Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is his final servant, the seal of all prophets, and I bear witness that Jesus, Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, the son of Mary, is one of his greatest messengers. Alhamdulillah. So let me just get a quick drink of this hot tea right here, and we'll proceed. Alhamdulillah, I'm ready.
Yeah, that's fine.
Are you ready? Okay. Bear with me 1 second. Okay. Celsus, the 2nd century scholar, says, and I quote, "It's clear to me that the writings of the Gospels are a lie. and that your fables have not been well enough constructed to conceal this monstrous fiction. End of quote. For centuries, people have been debating the crucifixion. Numerous debates have taken place. So to debate this topic is to admit that this topic is indeed debatable, because here we are in 2018, there's no solid proof that has ever been presented demonstrating that Jesus was, without question, crucified or raised from the dead. There's no sure evidence, it's all speculation. So it's impossible for Stephen or any other Christian to ever win such a debate, which is why I graciously tried to provide Stephen the opportunity for us to change the topic of the debate. So a fact is something that is consistent with objective reality and something that can be proven with evidence. People don't debate things unless the topic is unsettled or the evidence is inconclusive. So we need to, in discussing this, we need to consider, where did this debate originally begin and by whom was it debated? The crucifixion is an internal issue that's existed within Christianity long before the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, began receiving revelation of the Quran. So to direct the attention to Surah Nisa or the Muslims or Islam as if we're the center of the dispute is simply irrational. This is not a problem that I myself or any other Muslim is required to solve. So my objective today is not to attack Christianity, but to defend Islam against those who hypocritically attempt to brush their internal conflicts within Christianity under the rug as if they don't exist. Many Christians attempt to shift the blame to Muslims and Islam as if we're the problem. And they feel insulted and they feel animosity because of what the Quran states in Surah An-Nisa, verse 157. It states, they said in boast, we killed Christ Jesus, the son of Mary, the messenger of Allah, but they killed him not, nor crucified him, but so it was made to appear to them. And those who differ therein are full of doubts, with no sure knowledge, but only conjecture to follow, for of a surety they killed him not. This was debated once again long before the Quran, and I'm going to prove that here today, inshallah. So I'm requesting that Christians stop trying to shift the blame for this issue to Islam and stop pretending that the issues within their own religion don't exist. It's irrational to try to sweep the dirt under the rug in your home and then blame your next door neighbor for putting the dirt there and then also wanting him to come and clean it up. It's irrational. So I can't debate this particular topic only discussing one aspect of this as if I'm blind to all the other issues. To focus on one area is to turn a blind eye to the various issues that exist surrounding this topic. And it's undesirable information for my opponent, and he can pretend that the issues aren't there, but I refuse to do so. So let's go to work and let's try to clean this up. Obviously, the dispute about the crucifixion was amongst the early Christians of various sects. But this isn't discussed on Sunday morning. It's covered up, and historical and theological facts prove that to be the case. Harry Truman once said, there's nothing new in the world except history that you don't know. So let's look into the history of Christianity and see what's been hidden there. Christians debate this issue because they still have something to prove, and this proves exactly what the Quran states on the matter. But we need to consider, who is Allah referring to when he says, those who differ therein are full of doubts, with no sure knowledge, but only conjecture to follow. We'll start at the very beginning. In the first century, Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch, the vast majority of the scholars agree that the letters of Ignatius were genuine. And in the year 107, Ignatius was arrested and driven out of Rome, taken out of Rome. And he began writing a series of letters attacking other Judaic Christians and other Christian groups which held beliefs that were contrary to his own, which is all supported in the text of Philadelphians chapter 8, verse 2, which most Christians have not seen because it's not a part of the Protestant Bible. But in those writings it says, and I quote, do nothing apart from the bishop, the presbytery, and the deacons. Keep your bodies as if they are God's temple, value unity, and flee schism. And who's he talking to right here? He's talking to other Christians, and he's telling them to let's value unity, let's flee schism, let's not have division. And so he's trying to get them to compromise with him. And he goes on to say, and I quote, and I urge you, do not do things in cliques, but act as Christ's disciples. When I heard some of you saying, if I don't find it in the original documents, I don't believe it in the gospel, I answered them, but it is written there. And they retorted, that's just the question. That was the dispute, end of quote. So the dispute was over the documents that Ignatius had, which differed from what the documents possessed by the other Christian groups. It differed from what they had. And what they had did not mention anything about the crucifixion or the resurrection. The other groups believed that what Ignatius had was a corrupted gospel, whereas what they had were the originals, and That group wasn't a group of so-called heretics or Gnostics, and we'll get into that here shortly. They were actual Christian brothers of Ignatius that just simply didn't agree with what he stated. So modern scholars, in analyzing and translating the dispute, comment on the matter, and Professor J.B. Lightfoot says, and I quote, "The cross was still a stumbling block alike to Judaizers as it had been in the apostolic age of the Jews, though from a different point of view. They denied the reality of Christ's birth, his death, and his resurrection," end of quote. Professor Jan A. Duss, she says, and I quote, "The context indicates that the basis of the dispute was Ignatius's argument about the reality of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ, since these characteristics are characteristic of Ignatius's thinking," end of quote. Scholar Joseph J. Novak says, and I quote, "The reading of the text of Ignatius's letters suggests that the copies Ignatius relied upon for the death of Jesus were corrupted, whereas what the Christian group had in their possession were the originals, and it did not have Jesus as being crucified. Jesus' crucifixion was the central issue at hand, as many scholars have stated," end of quote. Other scholars that have studied this and agreed to the same contention regarding the crucifixion is Reverend William Osborne, Reverend J.H. Strawley, Reverend H.S. Holland. They all agree, and they've studied these letters of Ignatius. But let's go into the scriptures themselves, where we already see doubt about the crucifixion itself. In John 20, verses 24 through 29, Thomas, who was not there for the crucifixion because all of the disciples had fled, doubted the resurrection of Jesus, hence the name Doubting Thomas. So right there in the scriptures themselves, it already begins in these scriptures, if we can rely upon these scriptures, which history proves that we cannot. We already have one of the disciples of Jesus, peace and blessing be upon him, doubting the situation. In 1 Corinthians, I find it interesting that Stephen brought this up because in 1 Corinthians, what's going on there is Paul's trying to convince these other Christians to well, let's get into what the verses say. And starting in verse 12, it says, "But if it is preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there's no resurrection of the dead?" And he goes on to say in verse 17, I'm skipping just because of time. It says, "And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins, and those who also have fallen asleep in Christ are lost." So what is he doing here? He's trying to convince these people to stop saying that Jesus, peace and blessing be upon him, hasn't been resurrected. What this indicates is that there was contention, there was division amongst these various Christian groups, and history proves that to be the case. There's no doubt about it. In Acts 17:32, it continues and it says that now when they heard the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer, but others said, "We shall hear you again concerning this." We shall hear you again concerning this. So once again, we see dissension there, where some were willing to accept, listen to what Paul had to say regarding the resurrection, and some just didn't believe it and they didn't want to hear anything about it. 2 Timothy 2:18, it states, "But avoid worldly and empty chatter, for it will lead to further ungodliness. For their talk will spread like gangrene. Among them are Hymenaeus and Philetus, and they are men who have gone straight from the truth, saying the resurrection had already taken place, and they upset the faith of others." So once again, we see division here amongst these early Christian groups. In 2 Peter, chapter 1, verses 16 through 18, just in verse 16, it says, "For we did not follow cleverly devised stories." What are these stories that they're talking about? Let's go to Matthew 28, 11 through 15, and we'll get an example of one of these stories. And it says, "Now while they were on their way, some of the guards came into the city and reported to the chief priests all that had happened. And when they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, so they were bribing them, and said, you are to say that the disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this should come to the governor's ears, we will win him over and keep you out of trouble." And they took the money and they did as they were instructed. And this story goes on to say the story was widely spread among the Jews as it is today. Therefore, we have the theft theory. And so theory after theory, speculation after speculation. Why? Because they have no sure knowledge with only conjecture to follow, just as the Quran stated. St. Jerome, whose name changed from Eusebius, he says, and I quote, "The blood had not dried, and people were saying to other people, 'This is the Christ.'
Just got under 5 minutes.
But this is not him, but someone who looks like him." So division there. The early Christian sects, they failed to accept the doctrines that were agreed upon. If they failed to accept the doctrines that were agreed upon, they were kicked out of the mainstream church, and which eventually became Catholicism. Some of those groups believed that the death of Jesus led to salvation, where others didn't believe that he died at all. And not all of them were monotheists. Some were believed in 2 gods. Some believed in as many as 30 gods. Let's talk about the Nazarenes. They believed that Jesus was simply a prophet and a righteous man, and they accused Paul of being the heretic and adopting pagan customs for the authentic teachings of Jesus, proclaiming him to be God. And they believed that Judas tricked the Jews by substituting another man for Jesus. And commenting on this, he said, if the crucified man was Jesus, and if Jesus was God, who knew that he was to come down to earth in order to be crucified for the sins of humanity, the absurdity would be shattering at crying out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? The Basileans believed that it was Simon of Cyrene who was crucified, not Jesus. Other modern scholars, basing their research on the canonical Gospels, believe different versions of the crucifixion, such as biblical scholar Dr. Hugh Stonefield maintains in his book, The Passover Plot, that it was Jesus who was nailed to the cross, but he says that he did not die there. He only appeared to be dead by consuming a drug which was described in the book of Matthew as vinegar. Dr. Schoenfield believes that it was a plot to save Jesus from crucifixion, and after only being on the cross for just a few hours, Joseph of Arimathea came to Pontius Pilate requesting that the body of Jesus be taken down and that he give the body of Jesus. And so anthropologist Michael J. Harner of California University, corroborating with Dr. Schoenfield, says the white made from mandrake plant was used in Palestine to induce a death-like state in persons who were being crucified. And so there's so many theories that are involved here, and so that's where all this generated from. Muslims didn't create these theories. In the book, The Resurrection Myth or Reality, Bishop John Shelby Spun says there's a probability that the story of Joseph of Arimathea was developed to cover up the apostles' pain with the memory of Jesus having no one claims his death as a common criminal. But the reason I added this quote is because we see that the story of Joseph of Arimathea, it's a known interpolation. Arimathea has never existed. There's never been a place called Arimathea. It's a known interpolation. So how can we trust a book that has known fictional stories within it? I refuse to do so personally. Docetists of the 2nd century, they believed that Jesus' flesh was simply an illusion. They don't believe he was an actual God man. They believe he was simply human. He had an earthly mother and father. They don't believe that a spiritual being could also be a lower material being. They deny the crucifixion and the resurrection. And we still see Docetism developed into a number of Christian belief systems today, which is represented by people who ask, how could God be human and how could God have died? So if you've ever asked this question, you think the way the Docetists do. Of course, we as Muslims, we don't believe that Jesus died. So the Docetist answer to this was and is that God was never a human. God never actually died. Seneca and the Stoics. Seneca lived at the same time that Jesus lived, peace and blessing be upon him. And his story, the story of Seneca, life of Seneca, was a mirror image to that of Jesus. Many believe that it was Seneca that died for mankind. Seneca's brother Novatus was actually renamed Gallio. He's mentioned in the Bible, and there was reported letters from between Seneca and St. Paul. So once again, the early scholars were debating about who it was that actually died for the sins of mankind, if anyone did, for that matter, which we don't believe that. So the Marcionites in the 6th century, they believed that Jesus was simply, he was a savior sent by God. They believed that Paul was his chief apostle, even though Paul was a self-appointed apostle. They rejected the God of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. They believed that he was an angry God. And this, once again, this demonstrates division within early Christianity as related to doctrine itself. So various beliefs about various things. We also have modern Marcionism. You can look up an article by a gentleman by the name of Wesley Hill discussing modern Marcionism, which is still present today. And this is represented by people who push the Old Testament to the side, proclaiming that we're under a new covenant. While Jesus said, I've come not to abolish the law, I've come to confirm the law. So if you're one that says we're under a new covenant and you disregard the Old Testament, you're following the path that the Marcionites did. And so the Ebionites, they were actually led by James the Just. They were original followers, the earliest followers, as a matter of fact, of John the Baptist and the name of Jesus, peace and blessing be upon both of the prophets. They were led by James the Just, who's considered to be the oldest brother of Jesus. And they were considered, he's the oldest brother of Jesus, and they rejected Paul. They called Paul a heretic, and they rejected doctrines and traditions that were passed down. And so once again, we see division upon division. The Indians of the 1st and 3rd century, They believe that Jesus was a false Messiah. So, of course, people are going to want to claim that these people are heretics. So let's talk about that for a moment. It's a well-known fact among historians of the church that church fathers would exaggerate to extreme when talking about other Christian sects that didn't agree with what they believed. Second century theologian Irenaeus claimed that followers of Valentinius would have indiscriminate sex. They would have orgies, caprications rather, the same thing. They had indiscriminate sex. But one of the most outrageous examples of this is in the 4th century in the writings of Bishop Ephanius. In his discussions about one of the Gnostic groups, he says that they engaged in big feasts and orgies, and that the married couples would engage in sexual intercourse with other members of the community. And please excuse what I'm about to explain here, but he said that these people would collect the semen and they would ingest it, proclaiming this is the body of Christ. And they would collect the menstrual blood and say that this is the blood of Christ. And that if a child was born out of these interactions, that they would abort the child, they would dismember the child, they would cover the child with honey and spices, and they would eat it as a mess meal or some type of special meal. And so, of course, these are just claims to discredit these people. Just like we see Christians discrediting one another today. People discredit the Jehovah's Witness. They discredit the followers of Jim Jones. Of course, they committed suicide. The Branch Davidians. Some people discredit the Catholics, the snake handlers, the Seventh-day Adventists. And so we still see this division taking place because it's been division from day one. It did not start with Islam. And so claims that all scholars unanimously agree about the crucifixion is simply false. And we can't discredit someone because of what their belief is. Bruno Bauer, Robert Price, J.M. Robertson, Paul Louis Couchout, Earl Doherty, Tom Harper, G.A. Wells, amongst many others, they don't believe that Jesus even existed. And so, therefore, they don't believe that he was crucified. So we can't say that these scholars take precedence over these others simply because it makes you feel better. Let's talk about the Roman record. There's actually no Roman record of the crucifixion. And discussing this, Jim Walker, in the book, the Historical Jesus Exists, he says, and I quote, there occurs no contemporary Roman record that shows that Pontius Pilate killed a man named Jesus. He also says, and I quote, Tom Freaky and Peter Gandy state, and I quote, Jesus is said to have been crucified by the Romans, and they were renowned for keeping careful records of all activities, especially the legal proceedings. So we felt we could be optimistic that we could mention such a celebrated case.
1 minute left, Kenny.
That of Jesus. Okay. Unfortunately, however, they go on to say there's no record of Jesus being tried by Pontius Pilate or executed. One more quote by Pierre Scaruffi. It says, the Romans kept accurate records of every political and judicial event. There's no record of Pontius Pilate trying or executing a man named Jesus. End of quote. It goes on further, but I'll stop right there just for the sake of time. So once again, a fact is something that's consistent with objective reality, something that can be proven with pure evidence. There's no question. Fiction is something that is a belief, that is a statement that is based on something that's false and something that's imaginary, and it's an invention, untruth. And we see that in all of these stories that I just mentioned. So that's my opening statement. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much. And your time is up. Right. Well done from both sides. Thank you very much for your patience. Now we go to the rebuttal. We'll have 10 minutes rebuttal from both sides. So Stephen, when you're ready, if you want to start, let me just unmute you. One moment, Stephen. Right. Stephen, when you're ready, just let me know and I'll start your 10 minutes rebuttal.
Are you ready? Let's go.
Yeah, when you're ready.
Okay, so people can hear me, I hope. I need to ask, like I mean, I was shocked when Kenny began talking about semen and menstrual blood. I have absolutely no idea what has that got to do with the debate. What has it got to do with anything? Looks like that what we do is we find some extreme cult and somehow that discredits anything that has gone on before regarding that. I mean, there's just so much here. I did want to go back to basically no Roman historians, and yet I quoted, I don't know whether Kenny was listening, Lucius was a 2nd century satirist, referred to Jesus as a man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced this new cult into the world. And I quoted Tacitus, a Roman historian from the first and second century. Nero falsely charged this guild. This guild is the burning in Rome, with punishment with the most exquisite tortures. The person commonly called these persons commonly called Christians, who were hated for their enormities to Christus, the founder, a name who was put to death by Pontius Pilate. And so we have Tacitus says that Jesus, quoting, saying that Jesus was put to death by Pontius Pilate. So I don't know what Kenny really is talking about regarding that. The other thing too I wanted to touch on a bit and was and expand, but I didn't have the time earlier, was basically the criteria of embarrassment. Now, the criteria of embarrassment is when you bring up something, and it's used historically to really prove whether a person actually lived or these events actually happened. Now, if we consider what the Jews thought of crucifixion and the hanging on a tree, and what the Romans thought of being hanged on a tree. Now, I want you to think about this. I want the Muslims, especially the Muslims, to think about this. If you're going to start a 1st century religion, if you're going to talk about Jesus, you're not going to have him crucified because of just the perception of what crucifixion was in the 1st century. I also wanted to bring up basically, and I want to go down here for a moment. Kenny also talked about 1 Corinthians 15, and I mentioned about the creeds. Now, a creed is basically a statement of belief. And so when someone recites the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed, they're saying, I believe. And let's read this. Okay, I read it a bit earlier, but let's read this again. For I delivered to you as first importance, which also I received. In other words, Paul received this basically from those who were in Jerusalem when he went back to Jerusalem after he had been converted, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried and was raised on the 3rd day according to the scriptures. Now, that is a very clear statement. And then he goes on to say, and I think it's, that he was seen by a number of people. He names them. Cephas, who was another name for Peter, the 12, a title for, again, the disciples, and James, and then more than 500 witnesses, most of whom are still alive. We do not have one shred of evidence where any of these people said, no, Jesus was not crucified. He did not rise from the dead. Again, we have the hymn of Christ, another creed. We find that in Philippians chapter 2 on the crucifixion. It talks that Jesus was crucified on a cross. Regarding that, I need to look at because I did try to take notes, and bear with me if we look at some of these things. Kenny, I've got to ask you, have you got a plausible, if Jesus did not die by crucifixion, have you got a plausible alternative, something that we can actually believe? And do you have any historical evidence to back up that belief? I provided the historical evidence that, by showing you basically the documentation of the New Testament and and I showed you at least the genuineness of the New Testament by quoting the church fathers. And so far, you have not provided anything. You've mentioned a few cults and sects that are named. I think you said the Basilidists were the only ones that I believe that you actually named. I don't know if they named anyone else. But this is, you know, and you have failed to, you know, you failed to do that. Let's see else what we've got here. Oh, John 20:28. Well, I guess, or 20:29. I suppose if we read John 20:28, we have something talking about the deity of Christ, but we'll let that go. Obviously, Thomas knew that Jesus had been crucified. His doubt was, how can anyone rise from the dead? Not that Jesus had been crucified. Also, I mentioned, and Kenny didn't address that, was with, and since you brought up the Gospel of John, when Jesus is on the cross and his mother Mary recognizes, you know, sees him there. Obviously, she would recognize her own son, and Jesus recognizes her own mother, and he says, you know, "Mother, behold your son." And then he speaks to the disciple and says, you know, and basically says, take my mother into your home. Regarding that, Simon, Kenny also brought up Simon of Cyrene as being crucified. I want you to all think of the implications of this regarding that. If it was Simon of Cyrene, you have Christians from the get-go believing a lie. And, you know, Kenny was talking about conjecture. If anything that was conjecture was basically, you know, I'm trying to be kind, but basically the conjecture was basically on all these arguments that Kenny made, why the crucifixion didn't occur. He really hasn't, you know, given us any type of alternative. It could be Simon of Cyrene. Maybe he was quoting Hugh Schoenfield. That was a book written in the late, 65 to 68. And I think if I recall right, I've never read the book, but I am a bit familiar with it. But if I recall right, it's something to do with a mushroom cult, and you use basically that Jesus was, you know, trying to overthrow the Roman government. I do believe that's what the book is, but I will stand corrected on it. So again, this is pure conjecture. It's pure speculation regarding that. So again, Kenny, are you going to provide in your rebuttal, tell me what happened? If Jesus didn't die, I think I have a right to know what happened. You just can't say simply it didn't happen. You've got to give me something that is not only for me, but the rest of the people listening, a plausible account of actually what is going on.
1 minute left, Stephen. 1 minute.
1 minute left. Okay. Regarding that, I want to look at again, what are the implications for the Muslim regarding that then? Jesus did not die by crucifixion, that somehow he was rescued, and the Christians came to believe in the crucifixion very early on because they were tricked into believing so. What does that say about Allah? Maybe you want to think about that. Anyways, I may not want to expand that either in the crossfire or anything. Anyways, guys, again, thanks. I think that I've said everything I want to say in this first rebuttal. We'll listen to what Kenny has to say. Go ahead, Kenny.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Right. Kenny, when you're ready, just give me a shout and I'll start your time.
Okay, let me reset my timer as well. Okay, I'm ready. You ready, Mustafa?
Yep, please go ahead.
Okay, alhamdulillah. So, obviously, Stephen must not have been listening when I mentioned in my opening statement that this is not an issue that I myself or any Muslim is required to solve. Why? Because we didn't begin this issue. None of these theories that can be proposed, the swoon theory, the hallucination theory, the spiritual resurrection theory, the theft theory, the unknown tomb theory. None of these theories were invented by Muslims. These were theories that existed in Christianity itself long before the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, began receiving the revelation of the Quran. So this is not something that I don't need to produce a body. If, in the same token, someone could just as equally ask if Jesus was crucified, where's his body? That's far-fetched. Of course, I don't believe that he was crucified, but this is not an issue that the Muslim is required to solve, and that is exactly what I was trying to say by stating that we should not sweep dirt underneath our rug in our home and then expect and blame it on our neighbor and expect our neighbor to come clean it up. We didn't start these theories, and nor did I go to Stephen's home and dirty up his home and sweep stuff under the rug. So it's far-fetched in my mind. I don't mean to be disrespectful in saying that, but it's just simply not an issue that we need to resolve. It's something that we need to solve because our position on the matter is set in stone. They killed him not, nor did they crucify him, period. And that's what the Muslim believes. And so all these theories revolve around Christianity, which is why I didn't really have an interest in debating this particular topic. And I don't think that any Muslim, in my personal opinion, this is just me, people can do what they want to, but I don't think that any of us should adapt or adopt rather any of these particular theories and try to argue any of them, because none of us were there. Just like the Christian one that wasn't there, we weren't there. We can only rely upon what we've been given. I mentioned the fact of the semen and the menstrual blood and all that, and I was trying to demonstrate that these early Christian sects were villainized by they would villainize one another. As a matter of fact, they would this group would talk bad about this group and vice versa, and so there was division there, and they had various beliefs, and eventually history is written by the victors. So eventually these groups dwindled away, but once again we still see remnants of these groups. I mentioned the Marcionites, the Basilidians, Seneca and the Stoics, and I mentioned a number of different groups there. I want to read something out of the book. Which one is this? Bart Ehrman. Misquoting Jesus by Bart Ehrman, and it states, he states, as the Christian communities, and I quote, this is Bart Ehrman's book, as the Christian communities became established, they sometimes faced opposition from Jews and pagans, and they saw this new faith as a threat and suspected its adherents of engaging in immoral and socially destructive practices, just as new religious movements today are often regarded with suspicion. The opposition led to local persecutions of Christians, and the persecutions became official. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here, okay, here, this is what I'm looking for. Okay, alhamdulillah. So it says, Christians who understood the religion in fundamentally different ways began to have problems. Christian leaders began to write tractates that opposed heretics, that of those who chose to another way of faith. In a sense, some of Paul's letters are the earliest representations of this type of tractate. Eventually, the Christians of all persuasions became involved in trying to establish a true teaching, or the literal meaning of orthodoxy. They were all trying to establish what Christianity was supposed to stand for, to oppose those who advocate false teachings. So it goes on to say, these heretical tractates became an important feature of the landscape of early Christian literature, which is interesting. He goes on to say, what is interesting is that even groups of false teachers wrote tractates against false teachers. And so what I'm trying to demonstrate there is you had these Christian groups that were attacking one another, and one group is saying one thing, another group is saying another, and they simply can't agree. And that's how all of this began. That's how all of this division began. That's how these various theories began. The Marcionites believed one thing, the Basilidians believed another, theory after theory. And so this is, once again, my objective here today is not to try to provide an answer. Obviously, We're not going to solve this issue in 2018. It's been a debatable issue since the ascension of Jesus. So where were the Muslims at that point? Of course, we believe Jesus was a Muslim, alhamdulillah, but peace and blessings be upon him. But what I'm trying to point out is that there was no official group of Muslims that were involved in these disagreements in early Christianity. Muslims weren't running around Rome creating all these problems and all this division. This division was already there, and these arguments began. And so these scholars that we're quoting, modern day scholars or early day scholars, are simply, you pick your scholars, I pick my scholars, and the debate continues. And that's exactly what the Quran says on the matter. It says, those who differ therein are full of doubts with no sure knowledge, but only conjecture to follow. And that's the point that I'm trying to prove today. Who are those who differ therein? It was the early Christian groups, not the Muslims. Those who differ therein are full of doubts with no sure knowledge, but only conjecture to follow. It was guesswork. It was speculation. So they basically just, make, just one group attacking another, and eventually history is written by the victor. So what's going on here is that my opponent is engaging in what's called confirmation bias, which occurs when someone gathers information that suits their position or their desires or their beliefs. And so they gather information to the point that it meets what they're trying to achieve while rejecting everything else. So that's why I said that I can't look at this from one standpoint. I can't look at it from one position. I can't just go to the scriptures themselves and say, okay, well, you can produce scriptures that say that the crucifixion took place, and guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to produce two more that say the opposite out of your own book, alhamdulillah. So we could do that, or we could talk about the textual criticism. We could talk about the early scholars and what they believed, and then counter it with scholars that believe something different. We could do the same thing with modern day scholars. That obviously the debate's continuing. That's my point, that this issue is not a Muslim issue. And so I would like to leave from here today with my opponent and any other Christian that's listening to have the understanding that this is not a Muslim Christian issue. This is not a reason for division here. Muslims did not cause this issue simply because the Quran is al-Furqan, the criterion between what's right and wrong, and it corrects what is and reveals what is inconsistent within the Bible. But guess what? The Bible itself reveals what's inconsistent within it, because there's issue after issue within it. We're talking about a book that has multiple hundreds of thousands of interpolations that exist. We have words that have been added, whole phrases. As a matter of fact, the Jesus Seminary mentioned Robert Funk earlier, I believe, and they believe that in the Bible, that only, based on that seminar, that only 80% of the words attributed to Jesus were not his. That's the conclusion that these 150 scholars came up to. Okay, well, I've got the documents right here. So 82% of words attributed to Jesus, they came up to the decision.
1 minute left. 1 minute.
So, so we can go back and forth once again, but all this does, this debate within itself proves that the Quran is correct. Those who differ therein are full of doubts with no sure knowledge, but only conjecture to follow. There would be no reason for debate today if the matter was set in stone. There was no doubt about it. Jesus was crucified. There's no question about it. But guess what? That's not the case. Alhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen. When truth comes, lies must flee. Praise be to Allah. Thank you.
We've got 20 seconds.
Go ahead. I can see he can have my time.
No problem. Brilliant. Right. So now we go to our second rebuttal. Stephen, 7 minutes when you're ready, my good friend.
Okay.
Just let me know when you're ready, and then I'll...
Okay, let's go. Okay, I guess we're ready to go. Look what I got. Got the very book that Kenny quoted from, Bart Ehrman. And Bart Ehrman says that there are no major, despite the textual variants and his unbelief in the New Testament, he says there's no doctrine that is affected by these textual variants regarding that. It's also amazing that when I quoted Ehrman, I don't know, were you listening when I quoted Brother Ehrman earlier when he stated that one of the most certain facts about history is that Jesus died by crucifixion. I don't know why you want to do that. I also quoted Robert Funk, or mentioned him as in the Jesus seminar, that all these individuals believe that Jesus died by crucifixion. So why bring that up again? I don't know. Regarding that, I have to ask, how do we do history? How can we know anything that is a historical fact? There has to be a way. Kenny, do you deny the existence of Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar and Hippocrates and these individuals of the that go back into antiquity? I mean, do you deny the veracity of the Iliad written by Homer? And of course, you don't. You also then went on, we went on and we looked at basically the argumentation that Kenny has presented. Now, his argumentation is that, wants to discount anything that is supernatural on my side, yet affirm the supernatural on his side. His only argument, his only criteria for belief is found in Surah 4:157. Well, as a normal human being, as anybody with just a modicum of intelligence, should I not test that to see if it's true? My opening statement was basically is either the crucifixion happened or it did not happen. If it happened, then what is the conclusion? The conclusion then is that Islam is false. If it did not happen, of course, Christianity is false. However, that does not prove Islam. All it does is say that the Quran is correct on one point regarding that. And Kenny's other argument was, from what I could understand, basic argument, it was because there was division, therefore Jesus didn't die. I mean, that's not an argument. I mean, it shows really a lack of understanding why the New Testament was written, especially the epistles. But and the epistles were to correct false teaching that were beginning to occur. You have false teaching in Islam, and of course you had people coming and other Muslim scholars coming and saying, no, this is not what actually happened. So if we apply this standard that because there was division, the crucifixion could not happen, or it's mere speculation, then we can do the same thing with Islam. I do not know how how this is, how anyone can make this type of argument and discrediting the crucifixion. Kenny has admitted that he really doesn't have any real evidence. He just goes off on, second and third century sects. And really, Kenny, do you know what the Basilidians actually believed? And what they thought about God and who he was? Maybe that would be one of the questions we can ask in the cross, and see whether you know that. I'll ask another one. It was basically, do you know why the New Testament was written? Why was the Gospel of John written, and for what purpose? Why was Matthew written, and Luke and Mark? You really have failed to understand that. When I quoted Papias, you really didn't address regarding that he talks about the authenticity of the Gospel of Mark. I mentioned the Mauritanian fragment, which doesn't, part of it's missing, so it does not address Matthew and Mark, but it does attribute the authorship to the rest of the new books in the New Testament regarding that. And so we go back, and like I say, we look at the church fathers actually quoting, second century church fathers quoting the New Testament, then we have to assume that if we're quoting it in the second century, it had to exist in the first. This is the way you do history. This is the way you do look at any historical event. Obviously, none of us were there. Kenny wasn't there when the angel Gabriel spoke to Muhammad in the cave. So he has to go on.
1 minute, Stephen, 1 minute.
He has his own criteria of belief. He has his own set of standards of how he has come to the conclusion that Muhammad actually did see the angel Gabriel. And, all I'm asking for is equal scales, that we apply the same standards of history that he would apply to the Quran that we would to the Gospels. Okay, I'm done. I might have another 30 seconds, 15 seconds, but I'll relinquish my time and we can go to the crossfire.
Are you sure? You still got 20 seconds.
It's okay.
Right. Right, Kenny, you have 7 minutes for your second rebuttal, my friend. Let me know when you're ready and I'll start your time.
To answer Stephen's question, I do know what the Basilidians believe. They believe that Simon of Cyrene was crucified, not Jesus. In regards to Bart Ehrman, I've got this book in my hand right here, and he says, I kept reverting, this is Bart Ehrman, I kept reverting to my basic question, how does it help us to say that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, if in fact we don't have the words that God inerrantly inspired, but only the words copied by the scribes, sometimes correctly, but sometimes many, many times incorrectly. He goes on to say, we have only error-ridden copies, and the vast majority of these are centuries removed from the originals and different from them, evidently in thousands of ways. The thing is, in regards to these equal scales, I often hear James White, and I hear people repeating him talking about these equal scales. Unfortunately for the Christians, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but there are no equal scales. And what I mean by that is that you have one religion that is very consistent with a book in the Holy Quran that has never been altered in any way. It's in its original form, praise be to Allah. And then you have one that has been manhandled multiple times. Let me give you an example. The book of John, the word begotten is not supposed to be there. The story of the adulterous woman is not supposed to be there. So if we know that those are interpolations, these are fabricated stories, those are fiction, then how are we supposed to trust anything that the book of John says about the crucifixion? We simply can't do that. I can't do that. So if you're saying that you're questioning why I believe what I believe what I believe not because for one, I know that Islam is true. I find no inconsistencies in Islam, but in Christianity, I continue to find issue after issue after issue, and so there are no equal scales in that regard. And if there were, then obviously, we're not trying to be unfair, but the fact of the matter is that as we go back to the issue of the crucifixion, Islam did not create this issue, and it seems that people just simply are aggravated by the fact that the Quran states that of a surety they killed him not, nor did they crucify him, but it was made to appear as such. And those who differ therein are full of doubts with no certain knowledge, but only conjecture to follow. So, if no Christian in all this time has been able to set in stone the fact that Jesus was crucified, then the debate continues. That's why we're sitting here talking about this today. Otherwise, there'd be nothing to debate. In regards to the Jesus seminar, I want to read something in Robert Funk's opening statement. I want to make a point about it. He states, think about what he's about to say here. He says, we're about to embark on a momentous enterprise. We're going to inquire simply, rigorously after the voice of Jesus, after what he really said. In the process, we'll be asking a question that borders the sacred, that even abuts blasphemy for many in our society. As a consequence, the course we shall follow may prove hazardous. and we may well provoke hostility. The reason I wanted to read that quote is because we see this hostility when something is said against the Christian, what's accepted in Christianity. When something is said opposite of that, then the hostility begins. But once again, Islam, we're not your enemy in this situation. Our book says that Jesus wasn't, peace and blessings be upon him, was not crucified, and he was not killed. He ascended. Praise be to Allah. And so you have groups within your own religion that said this. So why make the issue between us and the Muslim and the Christian when you can go and if you want to debate this issue, debate this amongst your Christian scholars that feel differently, that have various opinions, or other scholars that based on the evidence that they've looked at, they have various opinions on the matter. Those who differ therein are full of doubts with no sure knowledge, but nothing but conjecture to follow. And so the debate continues. Otherwise, there would be nothing to debate. And so that's the point that I'm trying to make here. I want to read a quote by Isaac Meyer Wise in a book, Reason and Faith. He says, and I quote, "The credo which establishes the doctrine of Christianity is so full of contradictions and inconsistencies that I challenge any person to compose within the same compass of words anything equal to it or more repugnant to reason and common sense." End of quote. Another gentleman, Mordecai in the book The Challenge Accepted, he says, and I quote, "Christians adopt without examination the most contradictory facts, the most incredible actions, the most amazing prodigies, the most unconnected system, the most unintelligible doctrine, and the most revolting mysteries." End of quote. Why? Because all these theories exist. Everyone's theorizing what happened to Jesus. Is he the Son? Is he the Father that he's the Son of? Is 3 equal 1? All these different inconsistencies that simply are illogical, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that our religion is one religion and warns people not to accept partners with him. Praise be to Allah. And so that's my reasoning for being here today and discussing this particular topic. I don't have an answer for what happened to Jesus. As a matter of fact, you don't have an answer for what happened to Jesus.
1 more minute left. More minutes.
So there's if you can get with the other Christians and decide what the answer is, then we can take it a step further. But until you're able to prove yourself amongst your own people and your own group, I'm not, we're all brothers in humanity, but until you're able to prove that, why are you taking aim at the Muslims? There's nothing for you to do that. There's no reason for you to do that. And so it seems as though there might be a little bit of animosity, a little bit of hostility in one's heart that keeps directing their aim and their comments about towards Islam on a consistent basis, on a daily basis. I've unfortunately seen my opponent do that numerous times in this past month, and I didn't say anything, but obviously there's some disdain there.
And your time is up now, Penny. Fantastic. Right. Thank you, guys. Both speakers. Thank you very much. Now we get to the fun part. The crossfire. I can see Stephen laughing, which is good. It's nice to see my good friend Stephen and Kenny, both brothers, smiling. So it was a good debate, let's just say. Right, I'm going to turn on the microphone for Mr. Stephen Atkins. So
okay.
both
Mustafa, how do we want to set this up? Because
you tell me.
Just basically, who wants to ask a question, or does Kenny want to ask me a question, or shall I ask him a question? How do you want to set it up?
Well, it was according to the format. Let me just have a look. It's a 20-minute crossfire, 1 minute back and forth.
So we ask a question and questioning.
Yes, that's how it's supposed to be.
Because I was unsure.
Decided anything else, or was it a one question?
No, basically it was a crossfire. I just want to make sure, like, who goes first, or how are we going to go? It could be just on one subject. It could go off any place, or how do you want to?
So basically, you guys have 20 minutes to speak to each other. 20 minutes. Okay? So if you want to start asking questions to each other, you have 20 minutes to do so.
Okay, Kenny, why don't you go
Does
first?
that make sense?
Since I went
So I'm going to set my timer on for 20 minutes, and you guys, if someone speaks for more than a minute, 2 minutes, fine. You guys are going to make your time up together. So be consistent with your time, guys.
Yeah, well, let's keep it basically, within a reasonable amount of time.
Of course, yeah. And that will be between you two, because it's your time now. So I'm going to set the timer when you guys are ready.
If I go more than, how about if I go more than 90 seconds, you just beat me and now.
Okay. Okay.
Same with Kenny, goes more than 90 seconds.
Okay. Okay. Right. So, wait. When you guys are ready, just give me a shout, and I'll start the timer.
Yeah, I'm ready as well.
Okay, I've started the timer now.
Go ahead, Kenny.
Okay, so Stephen, do you agree that that there was absolute division within early Christianity amongst these various groups that were condemning one another for their various beliefs? Do you agree to
define early, please?
Huh?
Can you define early?
Well, I'm talking about early as you want to go back to the very ascension of Jesus.
If we look at basically, okay, if we look at the New Testament, go ahead, finish up.
No, I want to see if you recognize that you recognize that there was dissension there amongst these early groups. Do you agree with that?
First of all, you only quoted one or two sects regarding that, but from your earlier presentation, it's quite obvious you don't have a clue on why the Gospels were written, or why the New Testament or the epistles were written, and they were to counteract errors. Of course, there was some division regarding that. I mean, that goes without saying, but that doesn't mean something didn't happen.
Okay, so in saying that, so in admitting that there was division there, when God says those who differ therein are full of doubts. So who was differing therein? It wasn't the Muslims and the Christians. It was the early Christian groups that had varying beliefs about what happened. So I mentioned far more than just.
I was thinking.
Go ahead. I mentioned far more than just a couple of those groups. Go ahead.
Okay, when you asked that about being full of doubts, my question was basically, so what? Especially when you brought up it was, it's not the Muslims that it was brought up. So what? Obviously, I would acknowledge that. I mean, I don't think that's in dispute. Is that we have to look at how we do history, and how can we know anything that happened a long time ago?
Well, no, I agree with that. What you're not looking at is that the fact that there's not only 4 gospels; those are the ones that were chosen. There's dozens of gospels that were discarded, and these dozens of gospels that were discarded, it boiled down to they were eliminated. These groups that had various beliefs, these smaller groups, were eliminated. The people who didn't accept what the church agreed to. Matter of fact, during the Council of Nicaea, they were forced. Some agreed to the things that they agreed on during that council. But hold on a moment.
On the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Nicaea had absolutely nothing.
No, what I'm trying to make a point, I'm trying to make a point. The Council of Nicaea, they argued for 12 weeks. They argued about what it is that they were supposed to believe. And guess what? The people that went against the grain, they were dealt with. And so they were you either signed this agreement of the Nicene Creed, or you were expelled. You were just you were looked down upon, and a lot of these people were actually slaughtered and were killed because of this. So what I'm trying to point out is
okay, Kenny,
sure, go ahead.
I need to interrupt. He's going on. He's just going on and on and on. Kenny, the Council of Nicaea basically was a debate on the person of Christ, and basically it was not whether Jesus was God, or basically how he was God. So both sides acknowledged that Jesus was the deity. The Arians basically believed that he was a created being, but he was still a deity. The other side believed that he was, God from the very beginning. But what has that got to do with the debate? The debate is basically
Okay,
on
so
crucifixion.
what you're doing here is you're trying to read something into what I'm saying. I'm not trying to divert the topic from the crucifixion. What I'm trying to point out is the division
You're the
amongst
one that brought it up.
okay, I'm trying to point out the division amongst early Christians that was obviously there. And so those who differ therein are full of doubts with no sure knowledge. So these various groups that were disputing with one another, we still see remnants of that today, which is why World Christian Encyclopedia states that there's over 33,000 different Christian denominations in the world because people can't come to it.
Okay, Kenny, you made your point. I need to answer. Okay.
Sure.
Can you please name any Christian group that believes that Jesus was not crucified that's around today?
Around today, no, I can't tell you that today. And matter of fact, I'm not making that. I'm not making that claim. What? Hold on now. I'm not making that claim either, because for one, as I mentioned before, these groups that had these different beliefs, they were eliminated. To where all the gospels, all the doctrine, and all the writings and everything that didn't agree with what they were trying to make happen, they were discarded, as well as the people. And so that's a historical fact that no one can't dispute that. And so I'm not claiming today that there's no Christians that believe that the crucifixion happened. Obviously, they do believe it happened. Why? Because the story has been embellished and it's been propagated for centuries. And so obviously, if you grew up and your parents told you Jesus died for you.
You brought up you've done a couple of things. You brought up the issue of canonicity. Are you aware what the moratorium fragment is?
You were breaking up there. I don't know what you said.
Okay, yeah. You're breaking up. Are you aware of the moratorium fragment? Moratorium fragment. You know what it is?
Tell me what it is. I don't know what that has to do with the crucifixion, but go ahead.
It has an awful lot to do with the crucifixion.
Tell me what it is.
My opening statement was basically is that the crucifixion is basically attested to in the Gospels, and that the Gospels were authoritative. That was the very basis of my argument. And in my opening statement, I quoted a number of the ancient church fathers and other documentation that looked at the genuineness and the authenticity of the scriptures. The Mauritanian fragment is a document that it's not. We don't have all of it, but we have most of it, that states that the authorship of the Gospels and the letters of and the writings of the New Testament are attested to those that. Believe they're attested to. In other words.
I realize that. But let me question you about this matter, because what it boils down to, this is still confirmation bias. So what you're doing is you're ignoring the issues that exist within those very gospels. So if you're going to tell me that,
how so?
Well, I'll tell you how so. Because the story of the adulterous woman is the prime example, one of the most attested to stories.
Tell me. Okay.
Hold on. Let me finish talking. You asked me.
Okay, guys, we don't want to get off topic. We want to stick to the topic, please.
Right.
Well,
okay. So
let's look at this. Tell me, does the Gospel of John say that Jesus was crucified? You brought up the Gospel of John.
The Gospel of John also says that Jesus dealt with the adulterous woman, and we know that's a known fabrication. So the Gospel of John, if you accept something that has contradictions within it, and known interpolations, and known fictions within it, then that's your decision. I refuse to do so. So, I'm not telling you what to believe, Stephen, but I'm telling you that I refuse logically. I can't make myself believe a book that's been tampered with, that has known interpolations, and has been, it has embellishments in it. It doesn't agree with the other three gospels. It's in regards to Jesus is now God in the flesh in the book of John, or in the book of Mark, he wasn't.
Okay, Kenny.
Go ahead.
Kenny. Let's you don't want to go through the Gospel of Mark with me. I'll tell you that right now. But let's
do it.
That's beside it. Let me finish my point.
Sure.
Let me finish my point. All crucified. The story of the adulterous woman is basically a red herring. You're just throwing it in there. It has absolutely nothing to do with the topic of whether Jesus was crucified or not. Mustafa is that.
Okay, so let me respond to this. Once again, what I'm trying to establish.
What? No, let me speak. Let me finish. Are you going to let me finish or not? Are you gonna let me finish or not?
Yeah, go ahead.
Your real attack is basically you are not attacking the accounts of the crucifixion. What you're doing is you're attacking the veracity of scriptures. And this is the playbook that you guys always go to. Not only you, Shabir, even Mustafa has gone on that. We've gone back and forth. Anyone we've gone by basically is the Muslim always goes back to the veracity of scriptures regarding that. And
Right.
so we look at, again, part of my argument, let me finish, I just have 15 seconds. Part of my argument was that we examined the New Testament like we would any other historical document of its time. And then we can decide whether or not it's trustworthy. You have proven absolutely no evidence of that it's not trustworthy. Go ahead.
Okay, so my discussing the adulterous woman is not a red herring. I'm trying to make a point to you about the book of John because you asked me about the crucifixion within the book of John. And what my response to you was, is I can't accept a book that I know has been tampered with, that the scholars themselves know has been manipulated. They question the authorship. Matter of fact, they believe it was two authors. They don't know who these authors were. They're anonymous. They know that they were embellished and the story was expounded upon. And so you have a known story that is in the book that you want me to accept, a known story that's a fabrication within that book, that it caused me to logically question any reasoning behind accepting it. So if you don't understand that, what you're trying to do is what I mentioned already, confirmation bias. You want to accept what is in agreement with what you believe, and you want to reject anything that's contrary to it. So if you don't have a problem with these books being tampered with, and these stories and all these different stories about the crucifixion, all these different theories, once again, the Muslim did not invent stories. So if you want to brush them under the rug and then try to blame me for it, well, go ahead, go right ahead, Stephen. But what it boils down to is, hold on, I didn't interrupt you. You spoke for a good 90 seconds, I'm sure. But I wouldn't expect you to come into my home after I've swept something under the rug and you come and clean it up. And so I can't. A matter of fact, I can't expect you to come in knowing that I swept it under the rug and you pretending that it's there, and I'm trying to pretend that it's not there. But you get a big dog bone or something sticking out of the carpet. We can't pretend that these issues don't exist. And that's confirmation bias when you're trying to pretend and imagine these issues don't exist. Well, they do exist. And that's why all these Muslim brothers bring this stuff up to you, because we're dealing with a book that hasn't been tampered with, that everything is consistent. There's no inconsistency with it. It's in its original form in the Arabic text. So there's no equal scale there. The issues are all in Christianity. They're not over here in Islam. I'm not saying Islam doesn't have issues, but by no means do we have the issues that issue after issue that is within Christianity. I'm trying to say that as respectfully as possible. It's just the fact of the matter, and I mentioned that in my opening, that I can't ignore. I can't ignore all the issues and just try to focus on one thing.
Mustafa, he's going on and on and on, and I need to respond a little bit. How much time do we have? Mustafa, how much time do we have?
You've got 6 minutes left.
Okay, we got 6 minutes left.
So
could you just sort of like reel this in a bit on both sides?
Yeah, don't worry, I'll extend
it. On this. Okay, I was looking at this. We talked about sweeping things under the rug. I don't think I swept anything under the rug. I did acknowledge that there were a very small minority of those who denied the crucifixion. Actually, they said that someone else took his place. These were all Gnostics, by the way. Every one of them were not Gnostics. These are the same guys that didn't believe that Jesus had a body. That he was some type of phantom spirit, and that you can't crucify a phantom spirit. I also, and we see some hints of proto-Gnosticism in the book of Colossians, especially, and also you see hints of it in the first epistle of John, where there seems to be a number of people who were denying that Jesus Christ had come in the flesh regarding that. So obviously there were divisions regarding that. I also go on again. Let's get back to the Gospel of John, and again we're going back to the veracity of scriptures, because again, all for God. And you say, I can't believe. Maybe the question I should ask you right now is, what would convince you? Is there anything that could be said by me or anybody else, or any type of evidence that I could bring to you that would cause you to believe? And the answer is either yes or no. And if the answer is yes, what would that evidence be?
Okay, so for one, I don't give yes or no answers, and I don't allow anyone to dictate how I answer. I'm trying to be respectful when I say that. I don't let someone limit the way I'm going to answer my question. Um, uh, you know, what this boils down to, Stephen, is that um, no, I would not believe that Jesus, peace and blessing be upon him, was crucified, because I'm basing my belief on the fact that that Christianity can't decide how it happened, when it happened. There's no agreement there, and you actually admitted that, and you basically proved my case for me, and I thank you for that by stating that you do realize that there was these early groups that had these different opinions, and some didn't believe that Jesus had a body and all these things. Well, that's exactly what I stated in my opening. There was contention there, there was division there, there was various beliefs there. That so therefore those who differ therein are full of doubts, with no sure knowledge, but only conjecture to follow. If you have all these different divisions, obviously we're still debating this issue. It's 2018. We're still talking about this. So obviously, if the Christians could prove that Jesus, peace and blessing upon him, was crucified, then the debate would be over. But you simply can't, because there's too many inconsistencies. The inconsistencies within the doctrines of the manuscripts themselves, the earliest known manuscripts, that none of them match. They're all different. They all read differently. And you can talk about trying to make it a grammar issue. That doesn't have any weight, because you have stories that are added to the Bible and things that are taken out and placed in and reworded and moved around, and capital letters and punctuations and all that didn't exist back then. And so I know it's frustrating for you. I know it's frustrating for you. And
no, wait a minute. I have to interrupt you.
I didn't interrupt.
No, but I mean,
what this boils down to, once again, is confirmation bias.
Make your point so I can answer.
You accept what's in agreement with what you want to believe, what you so wholeheartely want to be the truth. You accept that, and anything that's contrary to that, you want to get rid of it. You don't want you want to make those groups. You can't put a size in those groups. You claim these groups were small groups. You don't know what the size of those groups were, but you're trying to discredit the issues, discredit the adulterous woman in the book of John, and discredit the various accounts of the women going to the tomb. And Jesus said, "Let there," just on and on. There's issues after issues. And you want to discredit that and push it aside, sweep it under the rug as though it doesn't exist, but it does.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we need to look at some things. First of all, I had to laugh when you talked about no capitals, or the difference between capitals and lowercase in the Greek, when the very earliest manuscripts, my friends, all the earliest manuscripts were all written in uppercase, and so it's a matter of how we work.
There was no case
regarding
the Greek. Is not,
are you interrupting me?
The Greek is not
Mustafa?
case sensitive. Well,
Mustafa, he's interrupting me. He's interrupting me. Please, if he's not going to let me finish,
let Stephen respond, please.
Yes, no. I mean, if he's not going to let me finish, mute him. That's all there is to it. Regarding that, I mean, he just brought up so much stuff. In the early Greek manuscripts, they were all uppercase. The upper and lowercase came along a bit later, and it just helps with issues of translation. That's all it does. Doesn't have any effect on whether or not Jesus was crucified or not. That is not really a very good argument. The other thing too is basically he keeps bringing up the adulterous woman, and is assuming that because that it is not that it is not there. Again, that is not the issue regarding that. It does not take away from the fact or add to the fact whether Jesus was crucified. It's a red herring. It's not even part of the should not even been brought up as part of the argument regarding that. The other issue is he said that I'm ignoring the fact that there were divisions. I haven't ignored the fact. I stated that again, and I've stated 3 or 4 or 5 times, that the reason that we have the Gospels were to address these very issues, to give knowledge on exactly what happened regarding that. I also brought up basically when we look at the church fathers, of course, there was divisions regarding that. Never blamed it on the Muslims. You're the one that said, well, the Christians are blaming the Muslims. We can go back through the debate and say, did I say anything about the Muslims, bringing up this issue? No, I haven't. They certainly bring it up enough on Facebook regarding that. And I mean, you have books by, all sorts of Muslim scholars telling me that Jesus didn't die, but that's beside the point. Let's look at what the first people in the first century believed. People in the first century believed that Jesus died by crucifixion. I quoted from the Apostle Paul, from the book of 1 Corinthians. I quoted from the book of Philippians, chapter 2. I also stated basically as we look at
Stephen, can you finish?
the gospel. Okay. Let me finish the statement. The narratives, the four gospel narratives, talk about the crucifixion. So this is it.
Are you done?
Are we at the end?
Fantastic. Right, so that brings us to the end of the debate. We'll have a 5-minute closing statement from each side. I'm so happy. I mean, at the end, the crossfire was a bit getting a bit rowdy. But you know what? I think it seemed, everyone was mature, and alhamdulillah, it went peacefully. Right. So should we start off with Mr. Stephen Atkins? Do you want to do your first 5 minutes, sir? And when you finish, we'll close the closing statement with Kenny. So when you're ready, Stephen, if you let me know, I'll
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, when you're ready, just carry on and I'll start your time.
I think that first of all, I want to thank Kenny for participating. He's a good guy. I appreciate that he's passionate. Thank everyone for coming by and listening. It can be quite frustrating sometimes when you say, "Why didn't he say that? Why didn't he say that?" Regarding that. But I did want to state that there's two really issues here. One is that came up was basically the veracity of scriptures. I think that's one of the issues regarding that. And I've made this statement many times in the past regarding the New Testament. And if we have an honest reading of the New Testament, there's only one conclusion a person can come to, and that is that Jesus died by crucifixion. And that that must be attacked. I think you saw that in this evening's or today's debate, that we had to go and attack the veracity of Scripture. And I'm not necessarily offended by that. I mean, we all have to answer to God for the things that we say and don't say, so we can leave that out. But the real issue, I think the real issue is not the crucifixion itself, but the why of the crucifixion. And this is, I think, the fundamental issue that really divides Christians and Muslims, is that my Muslim friend here has a very low view of sin. That sin is just and I don't think I'm misrepresenting his position, a mistake. And that it can be easily dealt with. And we look at the seriousness of sin in our own lives, not Kenny's life or Mustafa's life or any of the Muslims' life, but my life. The seriousness of sin in my life is such an affront to God that there was only one remedy. And Christian scholars have actually debated this for a number of years regarding this. And the conclusion has come basically is that there was no other way that the people that sin can be dealt with apart from the crucifixion. In the book of Hebrews, it says, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission for sin. So if you have a holy God, there are things a holy God can't do. And one of them is just to willy-nilly forgive sin. Sin must be dealt with. There must be a reckoning of the account, and that sticks with the judgment of God. And it also exposes the sin in our lives, those private moments that we have regarding that. And so I think, like I say, and I've dealt with Muslims for many years, and I don't know how much time I've got, but very briefly, I remember way back in the 80s, I was at a debate at the University of Toronto, and I talked to a Muslim woman, and I can't even remember what the debate about, but I do remember part of the conversation I had with her. And I came to the conclusion is the real issue that separates us, and maybe this is something that we can throw for a debate, is basically is the nature of man and the nature of God. And how, how does, what is man's true state? Muslims deny the doctrine of original sin. I would agree with the Muslims that the crucifixion would not be necessary if we could do away with that doctrine, if that doctrine wasn't true. Now, I know that it was not part of the debate, but basically it is part of my concluding remarks. And it is, I think, such an important part of the gospel message that Jesus Christ died for sinners, of whom I am chief. Okay, guys.
You still have 20 seconds, Stephen.
20 seconds, that's okay.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much. Right, let me just start my timer again. Kenny, you have your 5 minutes.
Okay. I'd like to end by saying I do appreciate Stephen engaging in the debate, and I do appreciate you moderating the debate, Mustafa. It's been enjoyable. It takes a lot of preparation to get ready for these debates. It takes a lot of you have to spend some time doing it, but praise be to Allah, there's far worse things that men could be doing with their time. So it's an honor to be able to discuss something that I do feel very, very passionate about, and I'm sure Stephen feels equally passionate about Christianity. And I want to make the point once again that this is not an issue that is Islam is not the root of the problem here, and I've demonstrated that in my presentation in the course of this debate. And basically, my position today was to defend Islam against those who are continually pointing the finger at Islam, as if Muslims are doing something wrong simply for what we believe. And unfortunately, Stephen kind of did that in his closing statement in questioning how I view sin. I'm not sure how he feels that he can has any understanding about how I view sin. I go to prayer 5 times a day, asking my God, my Creator, for forgiveness for anything that I've done knowingly or anything that I've done that I'm aware of. And it takes discipline for Muslims to do that. We take sin very, very seriously, which is why we're continuously seeking forgiveness. Praise be to Allah, because He's given us the route to do so. And He's directed us to the prayer itself. Matter of fact, in Surah Al-Mulk, we know in the Quran, chapter 23, verses 49 to 54, it says, "And we verily gave Moses the scripture that happily they might go right, and made the son of Mary and his mother potent, and gave them refuge on a height, a place of flocks and water springs. O ye messengers, eat the good things and do right. Lo, I am Lord, all that you do. And lo, this your religion is one religion, and I am your Lord. So keep your duty unto me. But they, mankind, have broken their religion among them into sects, each rejoicing in its tenets. So leave them in their error for a time." Praise be to Allah. Of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our God of creator, is discussing the various sects within Christianity where people have taken scripture and they've manipulated it to make it what they want it to be. Therefore, we have all these various denominations throughout the world. On any given corner in the United States of America, any small town, you can go to any block and you'll see a church on one corner that's different than churches on the other 3 corners. You go to the next block, you're going to see the same thing. Why? Because of all this division. Okay, and Islam didn't cause this division. Islam doesn't have the Protestants arguing with what's right with the Catholics and the Seventh-day Adventists. They worship on the true Sabbath, which is Saturday, whereas the rest of the Christians reject the Saturday, recognizing Saturday, and they worship on Sunday, and all the pagan influence that has been accepted into Christianity. Islam did not put it there. So my objective for this debate was only to defend Islam, not to attack Christianity. In the process of debate, of course, you're going to have to say things that are going to be uncomfortable for the opponent. We're not here to we're not here to make enemies by no means, but we are here to present our position. Once again, my position was only to defend what the Quran states in Surah An-Nisa, verse 157. It says, "They said in boast they killed Christ Jesus, the son of Mary, the messenger of Allah, but they killed him not, nor crucified him, but so it was made to appear to them. And those who differ therein are full of doubts with no sure knowledge, but only conjecture to follow. For of a surety they killed him not. Allah raised him to himself. Praise be to Allah." And so we have, we love Jesus, peace and blessings upon him. He's one of the five mightiest messengers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We cannot be Muslims if we don't accept Jesus, and we love Jesus. How can we not love Jesus, peace and blessings upon him? You notice every time we mention the name Jesus, Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, Jesus, peace and blessings be upon him, we give him high recognition, just as we do all the prophets. Because why? Because just as the Quran states, this religion is one religion. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our God, our creator, originally made this into one religion. It was man that deceived man. Allah did not deceive man. Satan deceived man, and he used man to do it, which is why we have all these various
and it's your time.
That's my time? Wow, time flies. Praise be to Allah.
It
It really does.
Can you, if you're willing, and those, if there's people who are out there, how many people are in the room? Just 5, or is it 99?
Just a few there.
How many people are listening?
1, 2, 2 people, excluding.
I'm quite willing to entertain questions for, shall we say, 15 minutes? Throw them at me.
Can do.
Kenny, what about you? Just from the audience, not each other. Okay. So,
We've only got 2 people.
Only 2?
I don't know how.
Okay. Well, maybe we should wrap it up then. Anyways,
I think so.
Now to end the recording, how do I do it?
Just press the red button on the recording, and it will switch off. I can probably switch it off for you.
Okay. Well, okay. What I want to know is basically, will I have something that I can edit later on?
You should do, yeah. If you press stop, it should automatically save it as a video file on your video section for your system. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, I hope I see anything.
This is the first time this is the first time I've used Zoom, so I'm not sure how it works either. But it did say when I was setting it up, it says it's safe to your computer.
It was definitely